In your birth chart, what things indicate that you're likely to get into good romantic relationships, and what things indicate the opposite? Now here's what you're going to get in this video. The first segment, let's look at the placements of planets and lords in good relationships. In the second segment, let's look at the placement of planets and lords in people with bad relationships. And in the final segment, let's subtract the bad relationship placements from the good relationship placements so that we get an exclusivity. What I'm analyzing here is, in good relationships and in bad relationships, the lord of what house is in which house. Is the lord of the 7th house, for example, frequently in the first in good relationships, or is the lord of the 7th frequently in the 11th in good relationships? Those kind of questions. Not just for the lords, but also for the raw planets. Like, is Jupiter usually in the 4th house in good relationships, or is it usually in the 8th house in bad relationships? Or how about Venus? What house is Venus in people that tend to have good relationships? So that's what we'll be going through in this video today. Now, before we go any further, let me state something obvious. Relationships take two people at least, right? So what you probably want to do is see your capacity for good relationships, look at your partner's capacity for good relationships, and see how they match. But today, let's just look at, in your chart, how likely are you to tend to be in good relationships versus bad relationships. So I felt that the 7th Lord and Venus would probably be indicative of whether or not people get in good or bad relationships. So first I made graphs and charts examining the 7th Lord and Venus. So here's the results of where the 7th Lord is in good relationships. Now, when we look at Venus, we see a similar thing about the 11th house. There's a big spike, close to 40% of the people who have good relationships have Venus in the 11th house. That's pretty basic stuff, right? 11th house is profits, gains, enjoyment, and Venus is romance. Now, so as I said, my bias was towards the 7th Lord and Venus, but I also just programmed the analysis so that I could look at every lord and every planet. And so here's some data on every lord. So the biggest spike, which is very, very, very interesting, the 12th Lord in the 7th house happened a lot. Another spike of similar intensity is the 3rd Lord in the 11th house. So what can we say about these placements? Well, 12th Lord in the 7th house. The 12th house is for sex. 12th and 8th house are actually for sex, and this is why you're finding Venus in the 8th house from the previous data was not bad. 12th and 8th house have to do with sex, and marriage has to do with sex. Relationships have to do with sex. So there's a nice similarity there when you take the 12th Lord and put it in the 7th house. Also, there's a lot of similarity actually, because the 7th house is where the sun sets, so it's where things disappear. The 12th house is about invisible things. So the 12th Lord in the 7th house actually generates a nice synergy, symbolically speaking. So it makes a bit of sense that the 12th Lord in the 7th house is indicative of people that tend to have good relationships that they describe as being pleasant, enjoyable. The other interesting one was the 3rd Lord in the 11th house, and that's the same thing. It's for the same reason. The 3rd house is the lust house. The 5th house is like passionate love, and this 3rd house is passionate lust. Difference is that lust is the thing that you want for yourself, and love is the thing you want to give. So the 3rd house being on the eastern side of the chart, and the east representing the self, whereas the 5th is on the western side, and the west represents others. So the 5th is about love, and the 3rd is about lust, self-oriented passion. So the 3rd house, therefore, is critical in sexual relationships, because sex has to do with lust. So the person has to have a hunger, otherwise they don't partake in the meal. Now the 3rd Lord is your hunger for enjoyment. 3rd Lord, 3rd house. So now here we find that in people that tend to have good romantic relationships, they have their 3rd Lord in a good spot. Then the third lord in the 11th house, the place where enjoyment can be obtained. So to take the third lord, which is the lord who desires enjoyment, and to put that lord in the house that provides enjoyment, it signifies that you're probably going to have enjoyable relationships. So there's other spikes. For example, the fifth lord in the 12th house. So as I was saying, fifth lord has to do with the passionate love. It's in the 12th house, which is a very humble, giving place, and also has to do with sex. We also got the 10th lord in the 11th house, which is just good for anything overall. It's a general success factor. We also have this very interesting, the 6th lord in the 9th house. The 6th lord in the 9th house occurs a lot in good relationships because it gives a person a work ethic. A person is willing to work and be patient, and that's an important part of good relationships. We also get a spike with the 2nd lord going into the 9th. And that's on the same reason. The 6th lord in the 9th gives you a work ethic. The 2nd lord in the 9th also gives you a work ethic and gives you family values. Because the 2nd lord's second house is about family. And 9th is morality. Another spike showed up with the 10th lord in the 8th house. And that's on the sexual side of the thing. Another spike shows up with the 11th lord in the 7th house. So 12th lord in the 7th house is good. Also 11th lord in the 7th house is good. It makes your interactions pleasant. The 11th is a pleasurable house. The lord is pleasurable. It comes to the 7th house, which has to do with relationships. One more is the 2nd lord in the 3rd house. Okay, now here's some data for the planets in good relationships. We found an interesting spike with Rahu. Rahu in the 2nd and Ketu in the 8th. Rahu in the 2nd and Ketu in the 8th were the biggest spikes in people who had good relationships. It happened the most often in people with good relationships to have Rahu in the 2nd, Ketu in the 8th. The only other spike that came close to this was Venus in the 11th house. So Venus in the 11th house is a key spike, and that makes sense. Everybody knows that. But this is a very interesting one. Ketu in the 8th, Rahu in the 2nd. So this is one of the things about Rahu and Ketu is to put them in correct houses that are synergistic with their fundamental nature. The 8th house is exactly the same in its symbolism as Ketu. So this is going to provide a deep experience of sexuality to have Ketu in the 8th. With Rahu in the 2nd, you'll get a lot of focus on developing family, developing income. It's the strength of Ketu in the 8th, really, that is making Rahu in the 2nd positive. Now, two other spikes to mention here is Jupiter in the 12th. And Saturn in the 9th. So Jupiter in the 12th is also on the theme of sex because Jupiter represents reproduction and the 12th is orgasm. Jupiter in the 12th is also good because Jupiter is charity and religion and philosophy, and the 12th is spiritual and humble and giving. So Jupiter in the 12th is a charitable disposition, a humble disposition, and fertile. And so that's a good combination for getting good romantic relationships. Saturn in the 9th, the way I would make sense out of this one is just to think this is probably indicating stable morals, which are the basis of most relationships that last and are good. Okay, so that was the data on lords and planets in houses in people with good relationships. Now let's look at the same for people with bad relationships. So once again, first of all, looking at the 7th lord, that's a big surprise. This is really surprising, this graph. It looks so much like the 7th lord in good relationships. So what we get here is we still have a big spike of the 7th lord being in the 11th house. So 7th lord in the 11th house happens a lot in people with good relationships. 7th lord in the 11th house happens a lot in people with bad relationships. What does that tell us? It means the 7th lord in the 11th house makes a person really interested in relationships and to have poignant relationships. Think about where I got this data sample from. These are the people that responded to my survey. So these are people who have a lot of active interest in their romantic life, and they have some pretty notable romantic relationships that they wanted to submit for a survey. Now, if we look at Venus in bad relationships, we don't have the same spike with the 11th house. So Venus is in the 11th house in good relationships quite often and not very often in bad relationships. The 7th lord was in the 11th house in both cases a lot. But Venus is only in the 11th house in good relationships a lot. But in bad relationships, Venus tends to be in the 10th house, as well as the 4th and the 1st. But there's something about the 10th and the 1st which makes it a little bit not so great for Venus. The 10th is very exposed. It's the house of the public, and the 1st is very me-ish. It's the house of self. And so Venus is not so keen on being openly exposed. And also Venus is not so harmonious with meanness, selfishness. Okay, now let's look at all the lords. We have much more dominant spikes in this data. First of all, we have a spike of the 12th lord being in the 3rd house, and then we have a spike of the 6th lord being in the 5th house. In these 96 charts, people that were involved in bad relationships, almost half of them, had the 12th lord in the 3rd house and or the 6th lord in the 5th. So you remember what I was saying earlier about the 3rd and the 5th house being the passionate houses, one passionate lust and one passionate love? Now, the 12th lord in the 3rd house is not so synergistic with the 3rd house as it is with, say, the 7th or the 8th. Because the 3rd house it's a very masculine house, so it's a lot about muscle and strength and power, and the 12th house is very weak in terms of muscle and power. It's very humble and invisible and dispersed and non-tangible. So the basic nature of the 12th lord coming to the 3rd house isn't so harmonious. So when you think about the topic of how it pertains to relationships, the 3rd house is your libido, and the 12th house is weakening it. So that may be why we found a spike like this, where 12th lord in the 3rd house happened a lot in people that didn't enjoy their relationships. Another spike is the 6th and the 5th. 6th lord in the 5th house. Same reason. Because the 5th house is your libido, your feminine libido. It's like the drive to be enjoyable. 6th lord going in there, 6th is actually masculine. So it's the same clash between 12 and 3 was a feminine type of energy coming into a masculine place. 6 to 5 is the flip side of that, a masculine kind of energy coming into a feminine place that affects the impulse to love. Okay, now finally let's get to the part that's really useful. We're going to subtract the bad data from the good data to give us an exclusivity or a purification of the data. So in other words, we're going to find how much is X planet in X house more often found in good relationships than bad relationships. So in my opinion, this is really where the useful information lies. So once again, let's start by looking at the 7th lord in Venus. So as you can see here, this is different than the other graphs because some of the bars go up and some come down. So the bars that are going down indicate negative goodness, in other words, badness. These combinations happen more in people with bad relationships. The bars that are going up happen that much more often in the charts of people that have good relationships. So remember the spike with the 7th lord in the 11th house? We had a big spike when we got the 7th lord in the 11th house and tons of good relationship charts, and we were like, great, this makes total sense. And then we got the same spike in people that have bad relationships. So here, this chart subtracts the bad relationships from the good relationships, and you see it actually happens a little bit more often, but negligibly so in negative. So actually, you can't use Venus, according to this data, we can't use Venus, 7th lord in the 11th house as a reliable indicator of goodness or badness. But we can use it as a reliable indicator of a lot of involvement in trying to enjoy relationships. So here's the data for all the lords in all the houses. Once again, the spikes going up are not quite as high as the spikes coming down, which might mean that it would be easier for us to make a prediction of a negative relationship rather than a positive one, which is fine. Because if you don't have grounds to make a negative prediction, you have grounds to make a positive one. The biggest spike in the whole survey was the 6th lord in the 5th house. Happened about 35% more often in people that are having negative relationships. The other one was the 12th lord in the 3rd house. The other really outstanding thing is the 8th lord in the 7th house was negative. And on the good side, 8th lord in the 11th house. We had 2nd lord in the 9th house being very, very good. We had 12th Lord in the 7th house. Now, if we do this same subtraction of data for the planets, Venus in the 11th house is a very significant marker for good relationships. So somehow we see that there's a difference between the 7th Lord and Venus. The 7th Lord in the 11th house merely indicates that the person is heavily involved in relationships. Venus in the 11th house is much more reliable to mean that this is good relationships that they're involved in. We got kind of a surprising negative spike for Jupiter in the 12th. But that's the same thing with 7th Lord in the 11th. Jupiter in the 12th was prominent in good relationships and in bad relationships. Actually, the data shows that it happens more often in bad cases to have Jupiter in the 12th house. As we said, Venus in the 1st house is a significant marker for negative. Venus in the 11th house is a significant marker for positive. Saturn kept out of the way most of the time, except Saturn in the 5th house is a negative indicator. Rahu, as we mentioned, was very good in the 2nd house, which means Ketu in the 8th house. And this was actually one of the chart toppers. This is one of the most significant hallmarks of people that will tend to have good relationships is Rahu in the 2nd, Ketu in the 8th. 30% more often in the charts of good relationships. Okay, so there's my report on my research. You got my data there about the planets and the lords and houses in good and bad charts as far as relationships go. I'll be exploring now other topics like dignities of these planets and lords and the nakshatras of these planets and lords, etc. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe to follow more. Keep up to date with me. I'll see you around.